Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue to talk about tax incidents, and we're going to talk about tax incidents specifically with how it relates to consumer and producer surplus, and we're going to ask what happens to consumer and producer surplus when the government institutes a sales tax on a product. So, of course, the first thing that happens when the government taxes a good, originally we were on this supply curve right here and this demand curve, and we are at an equilibrium quantity of Q1, equilibrium price of P1, all the normal stuff, and then the government institutes a tax. And when the government institutes a tax, that's going to shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. I did all this on previous videos. You can go back and check them out. And when the supply curve shifts up by the amount of tax, that's going to cause a new equilibrium price to develop, P2, new equilibrium quantity of Q2, which is going to be the tax base. And then, of course, we come down and down to the old supply curve and over, and we get P3. And then we can begin to identify the different areas, the consumer actual incidence, producer actual incidence, etc. But in this video, I don't want to focus on that as much. I want to focus on what happens to the consumer and producer surplus. So originally, the consumer surplus, prior to there being a tax, if there were no tax, the consumer surplus would be the area right here above the price and below the demand curve. Okay, above the price and below the demand curve. So the consumer surplus would be this upper triangle right there. That was the original consumer surplus. And so that, I'm going to record that over here. Prior to the tax, the consumer surplus was area A, area B, and area E. That's supposed to be an E right in here, that little triangle right there, which we'll talk about in a second. So areas A, B, and E, that was the original consumer surplus. The original producer surplus, that was the area that is below the price. So now we're going to be below the price and above the supply curve. So that's going to be this triangle right here. That's going to be that was the producer surplus prior to the tax, and that was areas C, D, and F. That was areas C, D, and F. That was the producer surplus. That was the area below the price and above the supply curve. And so remember, this is happiness. This is the happiness that the consumer is getting that he didn't have to pay for, and this is the producer getting paid above and beyond what was necessary to get them to produce the good. Now, the question is what happens after the tax. So after the tax, we now get this new supply curve, right? We get this new supply curve with this new equilibrium price. So now what's going to happen to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is now going to be above P2 and below the demand curve. So it's going to be above P2. That's the price the consumer now has to pay for the good, and below the demand curve. And so the new consumer surplus is going to be area A. The new consumer surplus is going to be area A above the demand curve, above the price and below the demand curve. So it's going to be area A. So the consumer surplus is going to be area A. And then the producer surplus, that's going to now be the area below what they keep. Okay, that's the price that they keep. So the producer surplus is going to be below P3 and above the supply curve. It's going to be below P3 and above the supply curve. So that's going to be area D. Area D is going to be the producer surplus. That's going to now be the producer surplus. So the question is, what was the change? What was the surplus that was lost as a result of tax? And then where did it go? Where did it go? So consumer surplus, what area was lost? Well, the consumer surplus was areas A, B, and E, and now after the tax, it's just area A. So what did the consumer lose? The consumer lost area B and area E. They lost area B, so the consumer surplus, they lost area B, and they lost area E. So the minus sign is just meaning that they lost it. Okay, so and that's a B right here. So they lost area B, and they gained. Sorry, that's getting a little hard to read. Let me just back this up. So the consumer surplus, they lost area B. Let's just write that again. They lost area B and they lost area E. Okay? They lost these two areas. And then the question is, where did they go? Where did those two areas go? So area B, where did that go? Well, this, remember right here, P2 to P3 over to Q2, that is now going to be the revenue, this right here, that's going to be the revenue that is collected by the government as a result of the tax. So where did area B go? The consumer lost area B. Where did it go? Area B, that went to the government, okay, in the form of tax revenue. So area B goes to the government. Where did area E go? Well, area E, I'm going to say that area E, like that went nowhere, right? Because from Q2 to Q1, these units from Q2 to Q1, the consumer used to buy those and they used to get happiness from it. The happiness that they got on their demand curve, that was above the price that they had to pay. So area E, that's happiness the consumer used to get from consuming from Q2 to Q1, and now it doesn't happen anymore. So we call that dead weight loss. So this area that they lost is called dead weight loss, and what that means is it didn't go anywhere. It just disappeared. It's happiness, it's consumer surplus that would have happened but didn't because of the tax. That is dead weight loss, and it's just gone. The dead weight loss is just gone. So area B, the consumer lost area B and E. B went to the government in the form of revenue, and E is just lost consumer surplus. It's just lost happiness in the world. Now, let's look at the producer. For the producer, what happened to them? Well, the producer surplus used to be area C, D, and F. Area C, D, and F. It used to be this bottom triangle. And now the producer surplus is only going to be area D. It's only going to be area D. So where did the producer surplus go? What did they lose and where did it go? So the producer lost area C and area F. Okay? So they lost area C and they lost area F. Those are the two areas that they lost. Where did those areas go? Where did area C go? Well, area C, that went to the government, because remember, this is going to be the government revenue. All this in here, that's going to be the government revenue. So area C, that went to the government right there. Okay, that went to the government. And then what about this area right here, this F? That's dead weight loss for the producer. The producer used to get paid a price above their supply curve. And so that was consumer surplus or producer surplus. That was happiness that went to the producer from Q2 to Q1, but no longer does. It's just gone. It just disappears. And so that is dead weight loss suffered by the producer. That is dead weight loss suffered by the producer. Okay? And so one last thing that I want to say about all of this, if we go back to our labels from earlier videos, this area B, this is really consumer actual incidence, because that's the lost consumer surplus that goes to the government. And area C, this is what we called producer actual incidence, which is the area that is lost by the producer and goes to the government. So it's important for us to be able to track as economists what happens to surplus when the government implements a tax. Where does the surplus go? What was the change in the surplus? Where does the surplus go? And what was the change, and where does it go to the government, or does it just disappear in the form of dead weight loss? All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another Econ podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.